Hey, friend, let's turn down the lights, slow your breath, and wander back in time. Far, far back, before pyramids, before empires, before even the idea of history as we know it. Because tonight we're not talking about what was, but what might have been. What if Atlantis was real? What if there was once a shimmering city surrounded by the sea, carved from marble and gold, where wisdom flourished and crystal towers reached toward the stars? And what if, instead of vanishing into myth, Atlantis had simply slipped beneath the waves, quietly, patiently waiting? Let's begin at the beginning. According to Plato, yes, the Greek philosopher, the same one who gave us the idea of ideal forms and the allegory of the cave, Atlantis was no fable. He said it was told to him through generations, passed down from Egyptian priests to Solon the lawgiver, from Solon to his descendants, and eventually to Plato himself. Atlantis, Plato wrote, was an island larger than Libya and Asia put together, resting beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. A land of mountains, fertile plains, forests, rivers, and a powerful civilization. Its people, wise, noble, strong, a hybrid of gods and humans. Poseidon, god of the sea, had fallen in love with a mortal woman, and from their union came the first rulers of Atlantis, kings with divine blood and a vision to match. The Atlanteans built concentric rings of land and water, perfectly measured, meticulously crafted. Bridges connected each circle, and the central island held the royal palace, gleaming with red, white, and black stone, covered in precious metals, surrounded by lush gardens and temples humming with spiritual energy. Fountains poured both hot and cold water. Walls were plated with orichalcum, a rare metal said to shine like fire. It wasn't just beauty, it was brilliance. The Atlanteans were master engineers, architects, philosophers. They studied the stars, they mapped the currents. They had ships, horses, chariots, aqueducts. They lived in peace for a while. But then came pride. The story goes that the Atlanteans, growing powerful and arrogant, set their sights beyond their shores. They wanted to conquer, and so they marched across the sea toward Europe and Africa. But the gods, who once blessed them, began to frown. Atlantis, said Plato, was punished. In a single night and day of misfortune, the island sank into the sea and was lost forever. But here's where things get interesting. Plato wasn't writing fairy tales. In fact, he was criticized for claiming it was a true story. He insisted it wasn't allegory, it was history. So, what if he was right? What if the fall of Atlantis wasn't just symbolic, but geological? What if earthquakes and volcanic eruptions cracked the earth beneath its foundations? What if the sea rushed in, swallowing temples, towers, libraries? And what if the remains still lie beneath the waves, unseen, undisturbed, unexplained? So, friend, let's go deeper, not just into the sea, but into the echoes, those soft, ancient questions that ripple through time. Because if Atlantis was real and if it truly sank, what might it have left behind? Let's close our eyes for a moment and imagine we're drifting down through the layers of water, past the shimmer of moonlight on the surface, past the dancing schools of fish, past the blue into the dark velvet beneath, and there, somewhere quiet, we might find it. The outer rings of land, now coral-covered and silent. The stone bridges, collapsed but still reaching like arms in prayer. The temple of Poseidon, roof fallen in, but its columns standing, proud and worn, like bones of a sleeping giant. What stories would those walls still hold? Would there be writing? Symbols etched into bronze tablets, half buried in sand? Would there be paintings on the walls, preserved in airless rooms, showing the rise of their kings, the rituals of their people? Some say Atlantis was more than just a city. They say it was a source, a center of knowledge, light, and energy. In some versions of the legend, later expanded by mystics and dreamers, Atlantis wasn't destroyed at all. It chose to leave. It is said that the Atlanteans, seeing the signs of coming disaster, sealed their libraries and temples deep below ground, protected by crystal domes and layered vaults, before retreating into the earth or beyond. Outlandish, maybe, but remember, for centuries people believed Troy was a myth too, until someone dug it up. They believed giant bones were dragons. That thunder was from gods in the sky. So who's to say? And here's a curious thing. Across the world, cultures tell stories of a great flood. Mesopotamia with the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Bible with Noah. India with Manu and the fish. The Aztecs, the Maya, the Aboriginal Australians, all speak of a time when the world was washed clean and something ancient was lost. What if those aren't just coincidences? What if they're fragments of the same memory, passed down in different tongues, from different lands, all pointing to the same sunken story? Atlantis might not be alone beneath the waves, and perhaps that's why it still captures our imagination, not as a place of doom, but of potential. Not just what was lost, but what might still be found. Hey friend, you're still here? Let's drift a little deeper together. We've wandered through legend and possibility. Now let's sit on the ocean floor beside the ruins of a stone plaza and simply wonder, if Atlantis was real, what did they know? There are whispers that the Atlanteans were far ahead of their time, not just in stone and sculpture, but in understanding the world. Some believe they mapped the stars, not with telescopes, but through still water and polished crystal. They saw constellations not as symbols of fate, but as stories written across the sky. The Pleiades, Orion, the Milky Way. To them, these weren't just lights, they were calendars, maps, memories. Did Atlantis chart the movements of the planets? Did they sense the pull of the moon? Feel the tides in their bones? Their architecture, if the legends are true, used sacred geometry, perfect ratios, golden spirals, the same math found in seashells and galaxies. It said their city wasn't just beautiful, it resonated. The placement of towers, the shape of canals, even the width of roads, all built with sound in mind. Some dreamers believe Atlantis worked with frequencies, that they used vibration to move stone, to heal, to communicate. Not magic, not miracle, just knowledge ancient and forgotten. And here's the strangest part. These ideas, sound resonance, crystal memory, harmonic architecture, are being explored again today, in laboratories, in sound chambers, in whispered talks between physicists and poets. Could it be that we are only now rediscovering what Atlantis once knew? What if their greatest treasure wasn't gold, but understanding? A philosophy of balance, a science of peace, a way of living in rhythm with the earth, the sky, and the sea. Because remember, in Plato's tale, Atlantis fell not from weakness, but from arrogance. They had everything, but they wanted more. They forgot who they were. And the sea, gentle, eternal, patient, simply took them back. Maybe that's the real lesson. That knowledge without wisdom leads to silence, and Atlantis became silent. If Atlantis truly lies beneath the sea, then it isn't just a ruin. It's a library, one where the books are made of coral, the shelves of carved basalt, the words written not in ink, but in silence. Some say the Atlanteans had ways of preserving knowledge we don't fully understand, that their memory wasn't stored in paper or scrolls, but in sound, in crystals in vibration. Imagine a chamber built not to echo but to remember. You step inside, hum a tone, and the walls respond. A history sung into stone. Far-fetched, perhaps, but the idea isn't new. Ancient temples across the world, in Malta, in Egypt, in Peru, were built with acoustics in mind. Not by accident, standing in them sound doesn't just bounce. It lingers, it amplifies, it hums through the chest like a second heartbeat. Could Atlantis have done the same? Could they have built their wisdom into the very walls so that it wouldn't be destroyed, just forgotten? Some believe their greatest structures were never above the sea, but beneath it. Vaults, chambers, deep sanctuaries, built to endure floods, time, even memory loss, hidden under cliffs, wrapped in layers of stone and pressure, waiting, and maybe, just maybe, they're still there. We've mapped the surface of Mars more than the floor of our own oceans. There are trenches deeper than Mount Everest is tall. There are entire mountain ranges, lakes, rivers beneath the sea, and we've seen only a glimpse. What if a valley exists, not empty, but filled with something else? An archway, half buried in silt. A statue, worn but watching. A doorway, sealed since the world was young. What secrets lie behind that door? No treasure, no curse, just knowledge, a memory of balance, a guide to what we once were and what we still could be. Atlantis didn't fall in flames, not in thunder, not in chaos. That's the part people often forget. In Plato's account, the island disappeared in a single day and night of misfortune. But he never said it was dramatic. He said it was swallowed, like a sigh, like the slow closing of an ancient eye. If the city was real and if it fell, how would it have felt? Not panic, but confusion. The tide rising a little too fast, the ground humming underfoot, a stillness in the birds. And then the sea, stretching farther than it ever had, returning with more than it took. Imagine the people, waking not to screams but to silence. Water in the streets, temples creaking. Not fear at first, just disbelief. Just questions. Then the towers began to lean. The marble stairs no longer dry. The ringed canals that once brought life now pulled it away. Those who could fled, not with treasure. There was no time. What do you carry when the sea is rising behind you? Not books, not gold, maybe a child, maybe a memory, maybe a story, held not in your hands but in your breath. And as the waters closed over the last dome, the city, once radiant, became silent. Still, buried but not broken. What if Atlantis didn't scream? What if it chose to fall in quiet? Like a civilization that knew its time had passed and refused to die angry. There's a strange beauty in that, to sink not in fury but in grace, to accept the sea not as punishment but as home, and now it rests, not gone. Just waiting, and sometimes when the tide is right and the wind is low, we feel it. Not see, not hear, just feel a hush in the waves, a pull in the chest, as if something deep below remembers, and wants us to remember too. Sometimes, to find what's buried, you look at what's left behind, not below, but around. Because if Atlantis was real, it didn't disappear without leaving fingerprints. It would have touched other cultures, left whispers in their stories, hints in their designs. Take Egypt, the pyramids, the temples aligned with stars, the obsession with death not as an ending but as a return. Some have wondered, what if that wasn't just Egyptian thought? What if it was borrowed, passed down from a culture even older? There's a theory, not proven but often repeated, that some survivors of Atlantis made it to Egypt, that they carried with them memories of geometry, of balance, of stars, and quietly rebuilt what they could. Not all of it, just fragments, enough to plant seeds. Then there's South America. The ancient city of Tiwanaku, high in the Andes, thousands of meters above sea level, yet once a harbor. Massive stone blocks, precision cut, too large for any known tool of the time. Puma Punku perfect interlocking stones. No mortar, no glue, just knowledge. Or the underwater ruins off the coast of Japan. The Yonaguni Monument, giant steps, flat plains. Right angles, is it natural? Maybe. But if you were looking for a city lost to water, that might be the place to start. Even Plato said Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles. To him, that meant west of Gibraltar. But what if it was farther? What if the world that remembered Atlantis remembered it from different shores? Myths echo. They change, they blend, One story becomes another. A memory becomes a metaphor. A place becomes an idea. But even ideas leave shadows. You see it in the architecture. You feel it in the math. You hear it in the stories told by firelight of a great flood, of a forgotten land, of a people who flew too close to the divine, not in arrogance but in wonder. And maybe they paid the price. Or maybe they knew it was coming and made peace. Either way, the traces remain, like footprints just under the surface of the sand, faint, but real. You don't always need a full city to believe. Sometimes all it takes is a pattern, repeating where it shouldn't. A number that matches a stone that doesn't belong. And suddenly, the impossible starts to feel familiar. Not all ruins are made of stone. Some are made of memory. Some live inside us. If Atlantis was real, and if it truly vanished, then perhaps the greatest place it remains isn't in the ocean at all, but in the imagination. Not as fantasy, not as fiction, but as an imprint, a shape we still recognize even if we no longer remember why. Why do so many civilizations, across centuries, across continents, dream of a golden age? A time when humans lived in harmony, when knowledge was sacred, when towers kissed the stars and the earth provided everything we needed. Why do we keep returning to that idea? Atlantis, Eden, Shambhala, El Dorado, different names, same yearning. Maybe we aren't just inventing. Maybe we're remembering. Some psychologists call it archetypal memory, patterns so deep they echo across generations, showing up in art, in story, in dreams. Atlantis might be one of those echoes. Not just a city, but a symbol of balance, of loss, of potential. And like all powerful symbols, it waits. It waits in quiet places, in the hush between waves, in the corners of maps, in the pauses between words. It shows up in literature over and over. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, Jules Verne with his oceans full of wonder. Even Disney gave it a kingdom beneath the sea. Why? Because Atlantis speaks to something universal. A desire to go back, to find the place we lost, to walk through streets lit not by electricity, but by understanding. And in modern times, we've gone searching. We've sent sonar across the Atlantic. We've dived into the Mediterranean. We've studied satellite images of the Sahara, wondering if perhaps the sea once reached farther inland than we knew. Each expedition ends the same way, not with certainty, but with more curiosity. And maybe that's the point. Atlantis keeps us asking, not just where was it, but what was it? Was it a warning, a hope, a memory from before memory? Maybe it's not lost. Maybe it was never meant to be found. Not as a city with walls and gates, but as a question. A gentle question, asked in every generation. What happens when we forget what matters? And what if we remembered? The ocean is patient. It doesn't forget the way people do. It holds on to things. Broken ships, scattered coins, old bones, and stories. If Atlantis rests anywhere, it rests there. Not as ruins you can walk through, but as a feeling that never fully fades. Because sometimes when we look out across a calm sea, there's a tug in the chest, a strange stillness, like something's just beneath the surface listening, not calling. Not warning, just waiting. Scientists have explored less than 10% of the ocean floor. Imagine that. More than 70% of our world is ocean, and almost all of it is dark to us, hidden, untouched. There could be mountains under there, cities, entire landscapes covered in coral and silence. Some researchers believe massive sinkholes and tectonic shifts could have swallowed islands whole, leaving no trace but a ripple in the seabed. Others think rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age drowned entire coastlines. 10,000 years ago, much of the world looked very different. What we now call seafloor might once have been fields, forests, and villages. And maybe, just maybe, one of those villages was more than a village. A capital, a sanctuary, a place of learning and light. When people say Atlantis couldn't have existed, they often mean we haven't found it. But maybe that's like saying music doesn't exist because you can't catch it in a jar. Atlantis might not be something you find. It might be something you feel, a pattern, a presence, a voice that speaks only when everything else is quiet. A reminder that not all knowledge is loud. Not all civilizations are meant to last in stone. Some were built to vanish, not in failure, but in rhythm. With the tides, with time, with the breathing of the world. And if that's true, then perhaps Atlantis never sank at all. Perhaps it simply slipped into a different kind of memory, one the ocean keeps for us, one we sometimes touch in dreams, in stillness, in stories like this one. Not every story is told with words. Some are spoken through symbols, through silence, through the way water moves across broken stone. If Atlantis left anything behind, maybe it wasn't in gold or ruins, but in language. Not one we can translate easily, not with dictionaries or inscriptions, but with feeling a language of pattern, of sound, of form. There are researchers who believe ancient civilizations understood communication differently. They didn't always write in lines. They wrote in spirals, in geometry, in placement, in how things felt, not just what they meant. Could Atlantis have done the same? Imagine walking into a temple. No text on the walls, no books on shelves, just shape. Sound, light slanting in through crystal windows at exact angles. You stand in the center of the room, and you know something. Not because you read it, but because the room teaches it to you, with silence. Some call this resonant architecture. Others call it imagination. But what if it's both? There are places in the world where sound bends strangely, where whispers carry across stone, where one note sung just right can linger long after the singer has stopped. The ancients knew this. They built cathedrals to amplify prayer, tombs to hold echoes, caves where the drip of water created music over centuries. If Atlantis was real, and if it truly valued wisdom, then perhaps it built with this in mind. Maybe their temples weren't just places of worship, but instruments. Each dome tuned, each corridor aligned, each stone a note in a song only the ocean still remembers. And maybe that's why we can't find them. Because we're listening with the wrong ears. We search for Atlantis with sonar, with satellites, with scans, but not with silence. What if the way to find Atlantis isn't to dig? What if it's to sit quietly, to listen for the shape beneath thought, the feeling behind myth, the story that doesn't need to be told, because it's always been felt. Atlantis may be hidden, but hidden doesn't mean gone. Some things don't want to be found. They want to be remembered before it sank. If it truly did, there must have been a moment. One final moment when the last tower stood above the water, when the highest spire, silver and worn by salt, caught the light of the morning sun one last time. And someone saw it, maybe not a survivor, maybe not even someone who knew what it meant. Just a distant traveler, a fisherman, a watcher from another shore. And they looked across the waves and saw a shimmer, a shape disappearing, not vanishing like a flame, but dimming, like a memory at the edge of sleep. That final glimpse, maybe that's where the myth began. Not with Plato, not with scholars, but with a nameless voice whispering across generations. There was once a city, a place where the sea swallowed wisdom, and the story passed on. Each retelling changed it slightly, added wonder, added warning, and yet through all the variations, the core remained. A golden city, a forgotten fall, a quiet end. It's possible that what we call Atlantis was never just one place. Maybe it was many. Maybe it was 1,000 coastal towns all erased by time and tide. Or maybe it was one great civilization, shattered and scattered across continents. And each surviving piece became a new culture, a new myth, a new name. But deep down, something inside us recognizes the pattern. We read of a world where humans lived in harmony, and we feel homesick for it. We hear of towers aligned to the stars, and something stirs, not curiosity, but memory. We picture a city that fell not in violence, but in stillness, and it soothes us. Because maybe Atlantis reminds us not just of what was lost, but of what could be again. Not in stone, not in sea, but in the way we live, in the balance we seek, in the wisdom we choose, in the calm we create. Atlantis might never rise again, but maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe it already lives, quietly, in every attempt we make to understand, to listen, to build something that lasts. Something not of gold, but of grace. Some things disappear loudly. They crash, they burn. They break the sky, but others simply fade. Atlantis, if it ever existed, didn't leave behind fire. It left behind quiet, a kind of silence that lingers. Not emptiness, but presence, like the air just after a song ends, like standing in a room where someone once prayed. The sea is good at keeping that kind of silence. It doesn't erase, it wraps, it holds, it lets things settle, lets them sink, and then it listens. Maybe that's why Atlantis remains so powerful, because it wasn't destroyed in rage or vengeance. It was released, let go by time, embraced by water, and now it speaks in ways we don't always hear, not in thunder, but in dreams. Have you ever noticed how stories of lost cities always feel familiar? Like déjà vu. You hear about towers under the ocean, and your heart flinches a little, not in fear, but in recognition, as if something inside you remembers, not clearly, not with names or maps, but with feeling, a longing for balance, for beauty not bought but built with care, for wisdom whispered, not shouted. Atlantis might be gone, but the idea of it remains. And ideas, when carried gently, last longer than stone. They seep into other stories. They become metaphors, myths, morals. Atlantis reminds us that even the greatest things can fall, and that falling doesn't always mean failing. Sometimes it simply means changing form. A city becomes a myth becomes a lesson becomes a memory in someone else's voice. And maybe that voice is yours now. Maybe just by listening, you've kept the story alive. Let it ripple through time once more. The silence of Atlantis is not empty, it is full. Full of what was, what might have been, and what still could be. Not as a roar, but as a hush. The kind of hush the sea gives only to those who truly listen. Not everyone fled. If Atlantis faced the sea, if the waters rose slowly or suddenly, some may have escaped. But some may have stayed, not out of fear, not because they couldn't run, but because they chose not to. Imagine them. Priests in quiet chambers, sealing doors from within. Librarians tucking scrolls into stone crevices. Elders sitting on rooftops watching the water rise, not as doom, but as destiny. They weren't just holding on to the city. They were holding on to meaning, to the belief that not everything needs to be saved above ground, that some things are meant to be preserved in mystery. There's a kind of dignity in that, a choice to let go, to become part of the myth. We think of survivors as those who run, but perhaps the true keepers of Atlantis were those who stayed behind, who whispered the last names, who closed the final gate, who watched the sky disappear through the rippling surface and didn't cry out. They might not have left stories behind in words, but perhaps their silence, their stillness, was the story, a surrender not to fear, but to time. And now, deep beneath layers of water and memory, they rest. Not forgotten, not lost, just still. And when we wonder about Atlantis, when we speak its name softly like a spell, maybe we're answering their silence with our own kind of reverence. They didn't survive, but they endured. Atlantis isn't just a city, it's a mirror. When we look into its myth, we see ourselves, our dreams, our pride, our longing for something pure, beautiful, and balanced. We project onto Atlantis what we hope for and what we fear. That's why the myth has lasted, because it adapts. In times of peace, we imagine Atlantis as a utopia, a beacon of wisdom. In times of trouble, we see it as a warning, a reminder of what happens when power outgrows humility. It reflects the moment, and maybe that's its true power. Not in what it was, but in what it becomes for each generation. For some, it's a tale of a lost civilization. For others, a metaphor for inner awakening. For a few, it's even a map, waiting to be decoded. But for many, it's simply comfort. A story without sharp edges, a mystery without horror, a fall without blood. Atlantis asks no urgency. It doesn't beg to be solved. It just floats there, quietly, patiently, inviting us to sit with it, to wonder, to drift, to remember something we never learned, but somehow know. And maybe that's why it's perfect for nights like this, when the world is loud, and your mind is full, and you need something ancient and soft to hold on to. Atlantis is that, a quiet myth, a soft shape in the deep, a memory of stillness that never quite goes away. And that, too, is a kind of legacy. Atlantis may have fallen not because it was evil, but because it dreamed too much. Not greed, not war, but overreach, the desire to know more, to do more, to touch the stars with hands made of stone and sea. That's a familiar story we build. We learn, we reach, and sometimes we reach too far. Not out of pride always, sometimes just out of longing. Maybe the Atlanteans weren't punished. Maybe they simply went too fast, too soon. A civilization that knew how to channel energy, how to speak in vibration, how to shape cities in perfect harmony, but forgot how to be still, how to rest, how to listen. The same tools that lifted them up may have unbalanced the earth beneath them. Maybe they disrupted something they didn't understand. A rhythm, a pulse, and when the sea responded, it wasn't anger. It was correction, not punishment, just balance restoring itself. The ocean doesn't rage, it flows. It gives, it takes, and when a weight becomes too great, it shifts. Perhaps Atlantis was loved by the earth, but love doesn't mean immunity from consequence. It means being remembered. And here we are, still remembering. Even if we never find the stones, the towers, or the rings, we found the lesson. And maybe that's all that was meant to survive. Atlantis might not be beneath the waves. It might be inside us, not physically. Not as DNA or buried instinct, but as architecture of the heart. Every time you long for something better, every time you imagine a world that is fair and beautiful and quiet, you touch Atlantis. Not a city, but a shape of thought. A way of dreaming, of creating without dominance, of seeking knowledge without destruction, of building something not just to last, but to mean something. That kind of dreaming never really disappears. It moves, it waits, it slips into songs, into paintings, into the way we imagine the future. You see it in temples, in gardens, in the way a child stacks stones without knowing why. Atlantis is the human wish to belong to something ancient and wise without being ruled by it. It's the pull toward the deep, not to drown, but to understand, to sink into silence and come back up with meaning. So perhaps the search isn't about sonar or ruins or sonar scans. Perhaps the real expedition is inward, a journey not to find Atlantis, but to remember what part of us is already made of it. If Atlantis does still exist, not in maps, but in moments, then maybe it's not a place we'll ever reach. Maybe it's a door, a final one, the kind that doesn't open outward but inward, a threshold in the mind, or the soul, or somewhere deeper still. The last door doesn't creak, it doesn't glow, it doesn't demand a key, it waits, and when we're quiet enough, still enough, it begins to open. What lies beyond it? Not towers, not treasure, just understanding. That nothing is truly lost, only hidden, only changed. That silence is not emptiness. It is memory wrapped in water. And that stories like Atlantis don't vanish because they're false. They endure because we need them, not as answers, but as companions, in the dark, in the hush before sleep, in the moments when we close our eyes and reach toward something deeper than dreams. The last door leads to that place, and if you've made it this far, maybe you've already stepped through. The sea doesn't speak in words. It speaks in rhythm, in pressure, in the way currents lean toward the moon. It remembers everything, not in stories, but in layers. One shell, one grain of sand, one quiet swirl at a time. If Atlantis sank, the waters would remember, not just where it fell, but how it felt. The sudden stillness, the absence of sound from its plazas, the bubbles rising as breath became memory. And still, the sea does not mourn. It carries, it integrates. It weaves the ruins into coral and current. Even now, the ocean floor is changing. Cities vanish, ships sink, time crumbles what stone cannot. But the sea holds. It doesn't bury to forget. It buries to protect, to soften, to soothe, to let things rest until we're ready to remember again. So perhaps when we listen to the waves, we're not just hearing weather or tide. We're hearing the stories it holds, the ones it's kept, just in case we ever come looking, gently enough. Part 18. A world that waits. Not every secret is hidden out of fear. Some are hidden out of hope. What if Atlantis wasn't destroyed, but preserved? Not as punishment, but as pause. A civilization that saw what was coming. A people who knew time bends, and so they built not for then, but for later. They left behind more than stone. They left behind resonance, structures encoded with sound, symbols shaped by vibration, designs that align not just with stars, but with memory. Not memory of events, but memory of meaning. And they trusted that someday someone would understand. That when we stopped searching for power and started searching for balance, the door would open again. Not in the sea, not in sand, but inside the way we think, the way we treat each other, the way we build and unbuild the world around us. Atlantis may be waiting, but not for discovery. It may be waiting for us to be ready. Part 19. The myth that lives Atlantis is more than a story. It's a mirror, a memory, a kind of shared dream, one we pass between generations. It shows up in paintings, in books, in quiet bedtime questions. It's the soft pulse in every story about a world that could have been, or might still be. A place where people lived not just with technology, but with tenderness, with knowledge used gently, with cities built for soul as much as survival. Atlantis is the myth that says, we once had it right, and we could again. That's why it lives on, because it offers more than answers. It offers calm. It reminds us that beauty can be silent, that wisdom doesn't shout, that peace, once known, is never truly lost. It sinks, but it doesn't disappear. It drifts into us, into the quiet places, into the heartbeats between distractions. It lives not in evidence, but in echo. Part 20. The gentle ending. So now we drift back, not to a conclusion, but to a kind of stillness. Atlantis was never about certainty. It was about curiosity, about the questions we carry in the dark. Where did we come from? What did we forget? And what is worth remembering? Maybe the answers lie under the sea, or maybe they lie within us, in the way we feel when we hear waves, in the quiet longing we can't quite name, in the pause before sleep when the world softens and the myths speak. Atlantis might never rise, but it doesn't need to, because it already has. Every time we imagine it, every time we hope, every time we choose calm over noise, grace over greed. That's the real Atlantis, not lost, just remembered, and in that remembering, we become a little more like the people we were meant to be. So rest now. Let the water hold you. Let the silence speak. The story has ended softly, but the sea remembers. If this journey brought you peace, if the waves of this story helped quiet the ones in your mind, then you're always welcome here. There are more myths waiting, more ancient echoes to explore, more calm beneath the noise. Subscribe if you'd like to drift again. We'll be here, where the waters remember. Until then, sleep well.